Good morning. This is Pascal Robert of This is Revolution Podcast. I am here with my co-host, my good friend, Jeff Kennedy. And for those of you who forgot, this is Fratguy Fridays. I, as a brother of Alpha Phi Alpha Fraternity Incorporated, and Jeff, as a brother of Omega Psi Phi Fraternity Incorporated, are here to bring you world events, analysis, politics, and deep dives into issues that we are concerned about as members of the two premier organizations of the Divine Nine Black Fraternities and Sororities.
Good morning, listeners. Good morning, good morning, good morning,
Good
good
morning.
morning, listeners. Good morning. I am Jeff Kennedy, member of Omega Psi Phi Fraternity in the second half of Fratguy Fridays with Pascal Roberts. So it's a pleasure to see y'all this morning. Let me just jump in here. I want to say a quick introduction to something y'all see I'm wearing, the 50th. I don't know if you can see it. Let me see if I get the camera on a little bit. Well, this is the 50th anniversary of my chapter, which is Epsilon Zeta, East Carolina University, which we had this past weekend. I want to give a special shout out to all my chapter brothers. We had a beautiful weekend. And we also donated $50,000 to East Carolina University to our chapter of Omega Psi Phi Fraternity. So you want to be congratulated for that. This morning, our show is on scientific racism and Black Greeks. Scientific racism and Black Greeks. And the point of departure today, what I'm going to do is to read the listeners a description of scientific racism from two places. One will be from Harvard. The other one will be from the federal government's National Genome Program. And I want you to hear these definitions of what scientific racism is. Everybody can sign in, share. We can see your real-time messages coming up. I see M. Bueller 119, good morning to you. Sign in and share, Fratguy Fridays. So let's go to our definition of scientific racism that I'm going to share with you this morning. Let me see. Is it right here? The first one I'm going to share with you is from, let's see, Harvard, I said. That page back. Let's see. All right. So if you go to Harvard Library's scientific racism page, it gives this particular definition. And I want you to see the reason why I'm doing this. I want our listeners to see what is being shared at our main universities and Ivy League schools and in different HBCUs, which is very important. It says confronting anti-Black racism resource, scientific racism. It says, since enslaved people were first brought to this country, promoters of anti-Black racism and white supremacy have co-opted the authority of science to justify racial inequality. A history of the pseudo-scientific methods of proving white biological superiority and flawed social studies used to show inherent racial characteristics still influence society today. All right. So that's everybody could go to library at harvard.edu. We'll put the link up later and look up scientific racism. That's just a quick introduction. Now I'm going to read to you another introduction that was on the National Human Genome Research Institute. This is the federal government. And this is the definition that they give of scientific racism. Scientific racism is an ideology that appropriates the methods and legitimacy of science to argue for the superiority of white Europeans and the inferiority of non-white people whose social and economic status has been historically marginalized. And then they go on to give some examples like eugenics and scientific racism grew out of the misappropriate of revolutionary advances in medicine, anatomy, and statistics during the 18th and 19th centuries. Charles Darwin's theory of evolution through the mechanism of natural selection, and then Gregory Mendel's laws of inheritance. And then it gives more definitions. And this is NIH's National Human Genome Research Institute page that I'm reading from. Eugenic theories and scientific racism drew support from contemporary xenophobia, anti-Semitism, sexism, colonialism, and imperialism, as well as justifications of slavery, particularly in the United States. Do you want to say anything about that particular definition, Pascal?
So it seems like, I mean, Jeff, this is your bailiwick, Jeff. This is your wheelhouse. It seems like what you're trying to do is basically give us a clear understanding of the way in which the illusion of science, notice I say the illusion of science, has been used and constructed to justify the fallacy of white superiority throughout history. Is that correct?
That's absolutely correct. That's absolutely. And so the question becomes, in dealing with this scientific racism, and we talked about this a little bit in our last show. We're going to talk about this probably in every show. The backdrop in which these organizations were created. This was a period of scientific racism. This was a period of eugenics. This was a period of debt peonage. This was a period of industrial slavery. This was a period where black codes had been given right after slavery, which these particular organizations were all created. So it just wasn't as though the founders of Alpha or the founders of Omega or the founders of Delta or some of the other, if I forget your organization, don't get mad at me. Don't get mad at me. I'm just not naming all the Greek organizations. It wasn't just the founders of these organizations thought that it would be a great idea to start a fraternity. No, it was so that they could survive. It was so that they could survive the withering attacks on Black America at that particular time. You know, white supremacy was roaring. The Freedmen's Bureau had closed down. So for the period after slavery, during the Civil War, they freed over 4 million Black Americans. During the period in between 1865 and probably about the 1940s, about a fifth of those people were back in some form of slavery. And that is what, you know, we need to talk about when we just start discussing our organizations. Why was it important that Alpha started? Why was it important that Omega started? What is?
Can I give you some textual evidence to bolster your position?
Yeah, go ahead.
I want to read a quote, if you will indulge me. This is a quote from Henry Arthur Callis, one of the Jew founders of Alpha Phi Alpha. This quote is in 1952. I fear that in another generation, the relationship of the years 1890 to 1920 in the establishment and growth of Alpha and the subsequent Greek letter societies will be lost entirely. When that occurs, our usefulness will be over. Alpha Phi Alpha fraternity founder June Henry Arthur Callis, 1952. Basically, what he's saying is that if our members forget the significance of the period of time that Jeff is talking about, if they forget what Plessy versus Ferguson did to Black people, if they forget what the rise of Darwinism and scientific racism did to Black people, if they forget what the fear of white genetic annihilation with the coming of the 20th century did to black people, if they forget what the global meeting that carved up the continent of Africa in 1885. I forget the name of the meeting. I think you probably remember.
In 1883?
1883, yes.
Yes.
Yeah. If they forget, our members forget what that means and how these men shape these organizations, the usefulness of our organizations will be over.
Well, let's discuss that. Let's discuss that a little bit. You say if they forget. What about if they've never learned? I mean,
Ooh,
what about if they've never
say it again for the
learned?
people in the
And
back.
see, and not to understand that the educations that we received and I'm throw you in also in these American universities, whether they were HBCUs or PWIs, as we call them, primary white institutions. They were created, as Carter G. Woodson so eloquently said, in the miseducation of a Negro, so that we would never be useful to Black America. And that's what people need to understand. If in many institutions, there is a sliver of individuals who want to give you information, and it's the entire information. It's not just going to be a portion of information. It'll give you an idea where to find these things at. You know, so the thought that the Black Greeks were, or that America were going to allow any kind of group, Black Greeks or any kind of organization, NAACP, or to be radical, Black Panthers, any kind of organization to be radical, where they would actually contend against American colonialism, imperialism, and capitalism. It's just the idea, it's just non-existent. I mean, it's not going to happen in American space. I mean, the United States government is built on making sure that that the social order that we have in place stays in place. And so the best that was thought to be that could be done at that particular time were to make ourselves American and to join in the project and maybe try to change America from within. And we've seen the results of that. You know, your analogy, tell people about your analogy about the Titanic, Pascal.
Oh, I said the aspiration of the Divine Nine leadership tier of the Black political class. And they are the leadership tier because the Divine Nine, these Black fraternities and sororities, are the educational foundation, the training ground, the elementary school for the Black political class, the leadership tier of Black America that negotiates the interests of the ruling class as opposed to the interests of Black America from the top down on to Black America. And to answer your question in terms of what our organizations are, is that we act as a buffer between the capitalist imperialist power structure and the Black masses, but not at the behest of the Black masses, at the behest of the power elite, because we reflect their agenda on the Black masses. And the way we manifest that and justify our position is to say, instead of having 14 deck chairs on the top of the Titanic, where are only for all white men, while everyone else is the bottom, but the Titanic is sinking anyway, we fought to have 13% of those 14 seats be Black, 16% of those 14 seats be white, 13% of those 14 seats be Latino, women, gay. So we were fighting to have 3 or 4 people sit in chairs in a group of 14 with a larger number of whites anyway, because there's more of them, on the top of the deck of the Titanic, while more of everyone else is at the bottom and the ship is still going to sink.
So, in your explanation, now, I don't necessarily agree with all of your explanation, but it was a interesting analogy. My point of departure comes from there were those who did exactly as Pascal is saying. There were some, not all. I never speak in absolutes, and I don't think Pascal is speaking in absolutes here either.
No, no.
There is, and within each organization, it was a radical spirit. There was a radical spirit that emanated from the founding of the organization. So, and going back to scientific racism, what I wanted to do was to share with you a little bit more about how this came about in America. You had scientists like Harvard's Louis Agassiz, who believed in polygenism. You had people who believed in biological racism, our biological, our statistics, our biology, our statistics, our genetics are all wrapped up into eugenics, the founding of eugenics in this particular country. So all of this goes into scientific racism that was going on at the beginning of the 20th century and still exists today. And that's what a lot of people don't realize. You know, some people say, Jeff, the first time I ever heard anybody say the term scientific racism was when you first, shared it. And then some people will have stories, Pascal, of never hearing about it until their 40s or their 50s. I think the first time I really had to struggle with the term scientific racism was I was in grad school, maybe for the third time at Howard Divinity School, sitting in a class, and one of the one of the doctoral students came and taught our preaching class that day, and he started talking about scientific racism. And I was thinking about it for a second. I knew what eugenics was, but I had never thought about it in looking at the long road of scientific racism in this country. And the basic conclusion of that racism is the biological inferiority of blacks in this country. Blacks, Latinos, it used to be Jews, and we spoke about this on another show that we had done before, Pascal, about understanding that it's inherent and it is still going on. The teaching that some kind of way that African Americans are biologically inferior. And I want to share with the audience today a letter that was written by W. Du Bois. Most people know W. Du Bois was the editor of The Crisis, the first African American to, well, it wasn't African American then. What was it? What would he have been at that time?
Negro or Afro
He'd been a
American?
Negro, or he wouldn't even have been a colored. He would have
Yeah.
been a Negro.
Yes.
So Du Bois would have been described at that particular time as being the first African American Negro to get a degree from Harvard University. The second was, of course, my fraternity brother, Carter G. Woodson. And I'm also going to share with you some of comments that Carter G. Woodson put in place about scientific racism and fighting this great perilous problem that was occurring at the beginning of the 20th century after slavery. And we want our audience to appreciate that the period after slavery for many African Americans was worse than slavery. Let me say that again. The period after slavery, from about 1865 to about the 1940s, for a large proportion of blacks in this country, was actually worse than slavery. The United States government found different ways to recreate the issue of slavery, including an industrial slavery, as I said earlier, peonage, as I said earlier, mass incarceration, which still occurs right now. So let's go to the Du Bois letter, where Du Bois is actually in this particular letter writing the pastor of answering a letter to Adam Clayton Powell, who was the pastor, Adam Clayton Powell Sr., who was the pastor of Abyssinia Baptist Church in New York City. And Adam Clayton Powell had written Du Bois, and he wanted him to include a letter that Adam Clayton Powell had written about Darwinism. And Du Bois refused to print the letter. And this is the reason why he said, and I wish at some point we can get it where we can show people what we're reading, Pascal. Or he says, "My dear Dr. Powell, I have read your article with the greatest interest." And this is Du Bois writing back Adam Clayton Powell. "I should criticize aversely only one statement, that is on page 1011 about Darwin's Origin of Species. I do not think it is an historical accurate to say that this book advocates the survival of the fittest or the conservation or the favored races. That doctrine was developed entirely in part from Darwin's book and long in its appearance. The book was seized upon to support the doctrine when, as a matter of fact, it did not at all. What Darwin said about the survival of the fittest, the survival of the fittest. Hold on a second. Let me see if we can get the rest of that particular. Okay, and that's the portion. The book was seized upon the support of that doctrine. The doctrine may, okay, excuse me. Okay. I do not think that it is historical accurate to say that this book advocates for the survival of the fittest or the conservation of favored races. That doctrine was developed entirely apart from Darwin's book and long before its appearance. The book was seized upon to support that doctrine, when as a matter of fact, it did not at all." So this was Du Bois saying to a pastor at Abyssinian Baptist Church about the issue of Darwinism, which of course we know turned into social Darwinism, which is still, social Darwinism is still a little different from eugenics. Eugenics is basically the science where you focus in on people having children. If it's not eliminating someone's opportunity to take children, not to have children, or putting them in a situation where it's hard for them to procreate, it's not usually eugenics. It might be another form of racism, but it's not necessarily eugenics. And so in this particular letter, that one passage where Du Bois says, that one passage that says, where Du Bois is defending or stating that the conservation of favored races was not in the book Origin of Species. The entire title of the first edition of the book, and I disagree with Du Bois here, because the first edition of the book was the Origin of Species for the conservation of the favored races. Later editions, that book title changed. So I disagree with Du Bois in this particular letter. I don't know what edition he was able to. I don't know what edition Du Bois was able to take a look at. But if you look at Darwin's book, the first edition. Let me see.
Yeah.
The first book, and you can look it up on line, Google, Wikipedia, anything, and you'll see in the particular title that it says, on the origin of species by means of natural selection or the preservation of favored races in the struggle for life. So I don't know in that particular letter why Du Bois was trying to critique Darwinism in such a way, but we had to go back to who Du Bois was.
What year was that letter
And we
written?
have to go back. That particular letter was That particular letter, I think, was in 1930. They don't have the actual date on it, but I think somewhere I read where that letter was in 1930, somewhere in the early 1930s. So we have to do a little deeper dive on.
So that was
that
likely
particular letter.
before. That was likely before Nazism had purged the utility of eugenics in the United States.
Oh, that was way before Nazism had purged eugenics in the United States. And people, and eugenics fell out of favor. That particular letter is important because Du Bois saw himself in writing The Crisis as someone who would set the tone academically and educationally of what Americans were reading. And the Greek organizations, from and say it very clearly, Delta Sigma Theta, aka Sigma Gamma Rho, the Zetas, of course, and of course all the fraternities. They were all struggling with these issues of colorism. They were all discovering with these issues of scientific racism, how they were going to fit into the American quilt. And as you said earlier, they decided that they were going to be this, as Du Bois wrote, this talented 10th. And then, that leads us to another conversation that I'm going to talk about later, a little while later, is Du Bois's idea that this talented 10th, which the fraternities and sororities would represent, would some kind of way become the leaders out of the American oppression, which they were feeling in the beginning of the 20th century. As we saw, Du Bois gave up the idea of the talented 10th in his speech later on to another fraternity that time that we're going to talk about. So it didn't. So the idea from the beginning that these fraternities were going to be the saving leaders of Black America out of its oppression, we come to find out, we come to find out later that this is not actually how it occurred. And still to this day, and the pluses and minuses of the fraternities and the sororities are are great in themselves. I'll just say it that way. I love my fraternity. I love some of my frat brothers. I love most of my frat brothers. I love the organization. But like with all organizations, and you particularly care for a lot of your frat brothers too, Pascal. As with any organization, we have challenges, and those challenges sometimes outweigh some of the better work that we do, and those challenges get actually more attention than some of the better work that we do. And Pascal's, and I'm gonna let him talk about his own ideology. It's just a little bit a different take from mine, whereas I see the problems. And I see the both sides. I see where we've helped and I see where we've hurt. And I don't believe it's all hurt, and I definitely don't believe it's all help. The story of these particular organizations, the fraternities and the sororities. I had asked a sister Dr. Jeanette Jones from the University of Nebraska. Maybe we'll be able to get her on the show later to talk a little bit about Delta Sigma Theta and scientific racism. Because I would really like, if we have any members of AKA who may be scholars in this particular area of scientific racism, understand, want to talk about eugenics or any of the other areas, we would love for you to get in contact with us on the show. Reach out to us, because we would love to present your work and hear your thoughts about this particular period of time. You know, what these organizations were going through, how they were, trying to deal with racism. You got to remember, during Red Summer 1919 was 4 or 5 years, 6, 7 years. Alpha was what? 13 years. 13 years after Alpha was formed. 11 years after Alpha was formed. The Red Summer of 1919, how were they going to protect their particular communities from, and all across not just in the United States, but all across summer of 1919 was violence against Black folks all across the world, not just in the United States. And it was this terror that Black people internationally were experiencing that led to the formations of these particular organizations. Pascal, you want to jump in here?
Yeah, what's interesting, right, is that a lot of people don't understand what was it particularly about that early period that caused this reaction of violence. First of all, it was a couple of things. One, because you had many Black men returning from World War I, these men coming to the United States in uniform, military uniform, knowing how to use guns. Many of them having to go back to the South, the Jim Crow Southern, West, white folk weren't too happy about seeing these brothers coming back to the States, thinking that they were Mr. G.I. Joe hero with the uniforms on. So that caused a problem. This is something that very few people know, but I know this because of my politics. In 1917, you have the Bolshevik Revolution, the Russian Revolution, and the development of the Soviet Union, which radicalizes politics domestically in the United States, even for Black people, which causes a blowback. Don't forget, a lot of these people, E. Franklin Frazier, even Du Bois early in the 20th century, considered themselves socialist. And they were paying attention to these global politics. A lot of people don't know the United States sent 10,000 troops to help crush the Russian Revolution to develop the Soviet Union in the Russian Civil War. So in that collective period of time, there's a massive persecution as well. And this is the age of the new Negro, where the newly educated or intellectually sophisticated Black person is trying to assert himself to challenge the violence and vicissitudes of Jim Crow in a more intellectually salient way. And there is competition amongst voices at that time. Du Bois did not like Marcus Garvey. Hubert Harrison did not like Du Bois. Worked with Garvey, but had some issues with him. Carter G. Woodson respected Du Bois, but had issues with the fact that he was taking some money from some very interesting places and wasn't as quote unquote, independent. Du Bois definitely did not like, many of them did not like Booker T. Washington for obvious reasons, who dies in 1915 anyway. So this period of time in the early 20th century is a time of serious intellectual contention. You have Pan-Africanism that's starting to develop as well amongst the Black diaspora, and particularly in the United States, the Caribbean, and elsewhere. And the American and the global power elite are trying to make sure that they could put a muzzle on that radicalism. And as hard as it is for us to believe now, the notion of having black secret societies, fraternities and sororities, or otherwise, rooted in believing that they were going to quote unquote uplift the race, in the eyes of certain white supremacists, was considered threatening, challenging, a threat to the status quo. Now, of course, the liberal power elite realized that these organizations were doing nothing but creating a buffer class to engage in race management. So what they realized is that, listen, we still need these Negroes to work in the plantations. And yes, they might start to get rebellious because of what's going on in the current world. But we can't just kill them all. Why don't we create a buffer class of Negroes who can kind of manage them and their aspirations while we allow them to believe they're rising up the power structure? And I'm not saying that Jeff and I disagree. My position is, and Jeff and I talked about this, is that the racial uplift paradigm is a bankrupt paradigm because it's based on the belief that just because you are black with a college education, there's something that a black person who wants to create a union for his job as a steel worker should look up to you about. Why? Both of you are ended up working for the man. You might have more status and a little bit of money, but that's only coming from the degree to which you contribute to the man's system of making sure that steel worker doesn't get a union. You want to jump in there?
Yeah, I wanted to go back and somewhat agree with you in um, how your view of the formation of these organizations, and disagree in somewhat to maybe the intensity of those particular efforts. A lot of times where we'll find that the majority may have not participated. There may have been the way the majority may have not participated. There may have been a significant minority
Oh yeah,
of people
yes.
who did these particular activities. Um, um, I just saw someone posted that scientific racism is a dishonored left wing straw man. And, sometimes I enjoy those particular comments because I mean, people have just never read. I mean, it's sort of hard to say that scientific racism doesn't exist. Every science organization, from the National Psychological Association, has apologized for scientific racism and eugenics. The American Human Genetics Society has apologized for scientific racism and eugenics. The Carnegie Foundation has apologized for scientific racism and eugenics. So even the eugenicists in Britain, in who created eugenics in 1907, they have apologized for eugenics. So it's sort of a ridiculous notion for people to even try to say that some kind of way this deals with left or right politics, because I don't accept those paradigms. I don't, and I know I'm a little different from Pascal. I don't accept this left right world paradigm. And you're just talking about, for me, the opposite ends of the same thing, and that is this imperialistic capitalism, oppression, and white supremacy that is over the entire world. So putting it in from a left to the right, that's that Titanic example again. those particular politics are not going to change the world. They will change the position of a small minority, but they're not going to change the world.
Well, you know, I want to disagree with that. You know, I want to disagree with it. They've changed the world already.
Yeah. So I'm trying to get Du Bois's letter that he said at uh, Sig Pi Phi,
Sigma
and
Pi.
I think that letter is very important. I'm trying to pull it up here. The entire address where Du Bois, here we have it, to be the keynote speaker at Sig Pi Phi, and I believe this was 1948.
Now let's make
And
this clear. Sigma Pi Phi is the boule.
okay, we need to tell people that Sig Pi Phi is the boule. And in this particular letter, Du Bois basically said that he was wrong to believe. I'm not going to read the whole thing. That he was wrong to believe. He was right to believe from his experience at Fitz, dealing with those educators who poured everything into him, to believe that this particular activity would be transferred all across America, where people would just see that defeat Black elders and griots and just learn and take in, and then they would go use it to help somebody else or to empower the community. And by the 40s, so this was in Du Bois's earliest, when he was at Fisk in his earlier career, the late 1800s. So by the time Du Bois had got to the 1940s, Du Bois say, I'm looking around here and finding out that these folks who are in these organizations have no intention of bringing anybody up with them or pulling somebody up by their, helping somebody up by the bootstrap or lending the hand or reaching back. No, these folks just want to be the 1% of Blacks who are comfortable in America. And that is somewhat, the falling out between Du Bois and Sig Phi. And he completely denounced the concept of the talented 10th. And what he talked about was the guiding 100, which I think in terms of, even if we tried to do the guiding 100 right now, we would find that it would still be that same problem with the talented 10th. That through a cycle, there are in all relations, in all religions, a small minority who are just going to decide that life is better for them, and they don't necessarily need to appeal to the broad wishes or insights of a particular organization. All organizations are going to have that. All personal relations have that, where some people decide that what's best for me is not necessarily best for the group, and that is how white supremacy in both sides of the aisle, whether it's coming from left politics or whether it's coming from right of politics, that's how they interact. That's how they interact with Blacks. If we went to, that's how they interact with Blacks. They just try to pick us off and get us to be representational of some bigger picture of life, of liberty, that they have no intention of us ever achieving in this country. As long as we are representational, and as long as we stay within the boundaries of what the exploitation is in this particular country, then we're basically safe and supported. Crime and violence will be a particular issue. But if we can separate ourselves in some kind of way, these safe suburbs behind walls, then we can enjoy the fruits of this country just like other people. And that's the way a lot of people believe now, that some kind of way that they are going to avoid the consequences of the policies that they've created. I know we've done a little conversation, Pascal, about the Obama years recently. We were talking about specifically Valerie Jarrett. And I found it interesting when I was researching and looking up Valerie Jarrett, that there was a controversy between Rosie O'Donnell back then, where she had said that maybe, I don't want to misquote her, but she had spoken about monkeys and how the some of the women that worked in the White House looked like monkeys, or and using that basic scientific racism language, because that's what it was, that that blacks were not quite human, and invoke that particular language. And we still deal with that today in our standardized testing, which is insane, which I'm actually talk about in a few minutes. But what I found interesting about the fight coming from Rosie O'Donnell to Valerie Jarrett was that same scientific racism was being supported by the Obama administration that had been supported by the Bush administration.
Absolutely.
And when people thought that Obama had become president and that some of this was changing, we started seeing that, wait a minute, we got some black folks who believe in this stuff too. Because not only in some areas, especially around standardized testing, did the Obama administration expand it. I mean, not only did they support it, but they expanded some of these racist practices. You want to talk about that, Pascal, a little bit?
No, absolutely. Because, we use this term, it's a fancy term, neoliberalism, which is a fancy word for saying hyper privatization, trying to diminish the functionality of the government to bring in private entities to fulfill state functionality. Or sometimes they actually would have increase in government functionality, but they would have private public partnerships. The whole school choice agenda is a way to neutralize public education by creating the capacity of private companies to receive public funds to manage public education. And part of that school choice agenda is bipartisan, because contrary to what people believe, like they used to believe in the 50s and 60s, that the Democratic Party is the working class, there has been a Democratic Party that was interested in the working class since the end of the civil rights movement. And
let me jump in. Let me jump in on something you just said about the school choice being bipartisan. People don't really understand what school choice is and where it came from. And what people need to understand was, after Brown versus Board, people wanted vouchers for their children to go to these private Southern school academies where they wouldn't have to go to school with black folks. And they needed a way to pay for that. And one of the ways they came up in Mississippi was charter schools. Another way they came up was with school choice. And the choice was that we could send the money to these private institutions, to these churches, to these, and they can educate their own kids. And we won't still have to attend school with blacks and Latinos. So that is where some of that school choice came from. And I wanted to go back to what you mentioned about Chicago, because I was going to bring, one of the last things I was going to bring up after SIG 5 was that in Chicago right now, the mayor-elect, Brandon Johnson, spoke in a debate where, and I wish I could pull it up, where he basically said that eugenics was not a measurement that could be used in educational testing. Standardized testing could not be used because of their eugenic roots. And it was meant to show the biological inferiority of black folks. But it wasn't just black folks. It was Italians, Jews, Southern Europeans at that particular time. And it later became as a weapon primarily used against black folks. So he was saying that we're in Chicago, the Democratic Party is, trying to eliminate eugenics. from at least its school system, from standardized testing. If we look in Vermont right now, I was reading something this morning where they've started a commission where they have apologized to all the residents of Vermont for their practices of eugenics. Those are the democratic efforts. But if you look at Washington, D.C., for example, we lead the country in promoting eugenics and standardized testing. I mean, so you have these Democrats. One is at the left, I guess, of the Democratic Party, and the other one is at the right of the Democratic Party, which would be the mayor of the District of Columbia. And for the District of Columbia to make these claims that that these particular policies actually work in education is just absolutely silly. So, we have these particular politics that are going on. I know I went to a hearing this week where we had Randy Weingartner, and she was testifying on school closings. And they asked her about the science that the American Federation of Teachers used. Who were the scientists that the American Federation of Teachers used? She basically said, well, we can name, what was the science? She didn't really have an answer, because the science behind a lot of decisions from groups like the American Federation of Teachers is eugenics. Why do we need to keep certain particular schools closed for so long when other schools around the world were open? What was the rationale? What was the science that was behind that? We wanted to make sure every child and every teacher was safe. But what was the science behind it? What was the science behind the pandemic? So when we start talking about scientific racism, and people say, well, I've never heard of science and racism being linked together. It has a very long history, and how it was taught to African Americans was the primary interest of the federal government. And that is the reason why they've always kept their thumb on HBCUs, to make sure that the real history sometimes would not be taught to even Blacks in their own environment. That the only thing that they would learn about was that necessarily the law, but not what was behind the law, or medicine, not learn about medicine, but not really understand what came behind these particular practices. So scientific racism was a huge issue in fraternities and sororities back at that time. I mean, if we look at Delta Sigma Theta and the club women, and we talked about that a lot with Dr. Robinson, and how hard they were on everyday Blacks. That is the thing that a lot of people don't understand, that it was in the beginning of the 20th century, it was no middle class. It was some Blacks who were doing very well, and everybody else was everybody else was struggling. And they strove for education. They strove to help build their own buildings. All throughout the South, they strove to find their family members all throughout the South. I mean, these were people who fought their way out of, slavery, and was now creating for themselves. And they were still getting a vicious response from the United States government. And in some ways, one that was even more vicious than slavery. And, that came along with Plessy versus Ferguson in 1895, where Plessy was only, I think Plessy was only like 1/8 Black. And they actually put him on there. They actually intentionally got Plessy locked up to challenge the law, and lost. Where the judge basically said that the Blacks are not inherently human. Again, and if you go back to Plessy versus Ferguson, there's language in there that says that, and once again, that blacks aren't necessarily human. If you go back to Dred Scott even further, there's language that is clear in there about this particular argument around scientific racism, that blacks aren't quite human. And these arguments have been beginning since the late 1700s with Agassiz up in Harvard. So now you have it finding itself in the law, that how do we justify treating African Americans in this way? And if you look at the medical procedures that were going on, the experiments that were going on with black women in this country in the late 19th century, the beginning of the 19th century, with Samuel Morton and others, I would highly advise. I don't have a book right in front of me. I would highly advise our listeners to look at Harriet Washington's book, Medical Apartheid, if you've never read that before, so that you can understand the fundamental nature of the attack that was going on black people when these fraternal organizations and sorority organizations were founded. You know, they were basically telling Negroes, and they did call them Negroes at that particular time, was that you were not a full human. And not only that, we're going to put it into law, and we're going to continuously keep trying to teach this until we teach you to teach it to yourselves. Let me say that again. We're going to continue to teach that you're not fully human, and that you are biologically inferior to white folks until we learn to teach it to yourselves. And that is where we are in many instances in this country right now. We have large communities of Latinos and of black folks who've never heard the term scientific racism, as you said, or eugenics, Pascal, as we talked about earlier this week. We have large, and the reason why is because once we start talking about scientific racism in this country, many of the pillars of economics, biology, of science, of finance starts to wither away once because what is supporting capitalism in this country? And that is, and largely, the capitalism was built on what? Slavery and white supremacy. So, how do we maintain this around the world? We have to have some form of a perpetual society where we have winners and losers. And then scientific racism is the process in which they have created worldwide to make this happen. So what are our prospects of changing the situation? I know when I talk to Congress people, or I talk to senators, and I am, for the first time for some of them, sharing the word scientific racism or eugenics. I just spoke to a congressman member 2 days ago, and I explained to her what eugenics was, but this was the first time she's ever heard it in her particular life. So, and that, for a large part, has been my experience with most of the senators that I spoke to, and definitely most of the Congress people. So we're sharing this with this particular audience because we want you to be familiar with these terms as we move along with this show. Pascal, you have something you want to add?
No, I just want to say that I really appreciate us using this as an opportunity to introduce people at a little deeper level in terms of what scientific racism is, which is something that Jeff has dedicated his life to really fighting because he understands the historical origins and dangers. And the main thing that I want to put in here is that we've been kind of diplomatic in saying this, But our organizations, the Divine Non-Black Fraternities and Sororities, sadly, were at the vanguard of supporting these policies in the early 20th century in ways that negatively affected poor and working class Black people. And we have replicated our position in doing that today by supporting things like scientific racism, charter schools, neoliberalism, and all of these other phenomena that are trying to deny Black and brown children the capacity to get the quality education and other things that they need, that ends up demarcating them as being biologically or culturally deficient.
So let me jump in. Let me jump in here again. We may disagree to the degree that is true. I agree that it's true, but I disagree to the degree.
It's not all of it. No,
not,
I mean, I was
right. It's not
it.
a situation where the vast majority of people who are Black Greeks have decided that we are going to screw over Black people. That's not the case at all. That's not the case at all.
It's what you would call
but benign. We do have a small minority.
It's benign neglect.
In the fraternities and the sororities that have been absolutely vicious to Black folks.
Well, the problem,
and especially Black folks.
The problem is the paradigm of racial uplift and respectability is rooted in the matrix of uplift and respectable to a system that is rooted in your destruction.
Well, yeah, uplift and respectability politics are built in eugenics, and that is some of the fundamental problem. But I was trying to keep us focused in on scientific racism on this particular show. So we may need to have another show where we are starting to talk about what he just said, respectability politics. We really need to focus on respectability politics and how it comes from eugenics. And we can't just do this in one particular show. So, this is some of my topic. So I'm going to be bringing this up from time to time and including the ideas and the comments that the wonderful comments that we're going to get from Brother Roberts. So
Robert, you forgetting the French.
Robert. These Negroes, it got to be Robert. No, I'm just messing with you.
Well, listen, we're over an hour now. I would like to thank everyone for coming out this morning for Fratguy Fridays, our second edition. We're going to be doing more of these. We're going to try to have them at first at least twice a month, bi-weekly, and we'll evolve to see if we're going to go further than that. As you guys may not know, the format is we alternate subject matters. The first episode, I chose the subject matter. This episode, Jeff chose. I will choose the next episode, which I have not yet. I do not have my subject matter yet. So we will be letting you know when we'll be doing the next Fratguy Friday, which, God willing, will be the week after next. And come in, join us, join the chat, send us questions and commentary.
Share and like,
subscribe. And,
yes.
We will definitely keep in touch. Thank you for checking out This is Revolution podcast and joining the show. And I would like to say thank you to my fellow frater, Jeff Kennedy of Omega Psi Phi. I'm Pascal Robert of Alpha Phi Alpha. And Jeff, we are out.
Peace.